Julie Carlson, who's going to present on labor markets. And right after Julie, we will have a 15 minutes break. So Julie?
Yes, so unlike the rest, I'm going to use slides. And also, unlike the rest, I don't have any formal legal training apart from what sort of rubbed off on me from my time at the FTC. So I'm an economist strictly. And so we heard a lot today from Commissioner Wilson about workers, and we've been hearing a lot from leadership at both of the agencies about workers. And so as an economist, sort of my approach to these issues is there evidence that we need to do something different? Like, is there a problem here that the current sort of system is not adequate to solve? And then looking at, are the things that are being proposed, do we think that they're going to work, or are there potentially some unintended consequences? And so that's what I'm going to focus on today. So I'm going to talk about just two proposals that are out there in the wild right now with respect to labor markets, and then talk about how sort of the theory behind some of these proposals and the evidence may or may not actually support them, and then maybe then finish with some unexpected effects of the proposals, and I'll take them one at a time. So I want to start with this bill that was introduced by Senator Warren in the Senate, the Prohibiting Anticompetitive Mergers Act. It is a fascinating read. If you it's breathtakingly aggressive in its anti-merger stance, but it does also have some labor market provisions in it. And so I just highlight some of the motivation and some of the provisions here. So there's this claim that there's excessive market power in labor markets, and this is, depressed wages, the recent rise in corporate consolidations, increased unemployment, suppressed wages. This is a very common refrain you'll hear from the neo-Brandeisians. And so two of the provisions that are specific to labor in the bill is that mergers which have labor market shares of 25% or more are just per se illegal, right? And then it also directs the agencies to look at the labor market impacts of deals. Okay, so I'd like to talk a little bit about the evidence on labor market concentration, because very much like the narrative of product market concentration, we keep hearing about how markets are highly concentrated and how concentration has been increasing over time. And the evidence just doesn't really support that narrative, right? So labor markets, in fact, aren't highly concentrated. So the trends in labor market concentration mirror the trends in product market concentration. So if you look carefully what's going on with product market concentration, while there may be some increases in aggregate measures of product market concentration, when you really drill down to the level of a relevant product market, a local relevant product market, concentration in product markets has been falling. You see the exact same story in labor markets, that while national concentration, when we look at these very aggregated data, national concentration has been increasing, but local labor market concentration, so what you would think of as a relevant labor market in the antitrust sense, has actually been falling since the mid-1980s. This one study by Berger and his co-authors estimated falling to around of HHI of around 1,000 by 2013. This other study by Rins has a similar flavor to it. Local concentration has been falling. And I think importantly, the labor markets with the highest levels of concentration have seen the biggest decreases in labor market concentration. So this story that labor markets are very concentrated and this concentration is depressing wages for workers, at least the concentration piece of that, right, doesn't seem to hold up. Okay, So what evidence do we have on the exercise of market power in labor markets? And so I think it's really interesting here to look at a particular occupation, and that's nurses. And in part, I think this is an interesting story to look at, or occupation to look at first, because this is sort of the classic occupation that people talk about when they're talking about sort of classic labor monopsony issues in labor markets, right? So, you have these big hospital mergers and, nurses, their occupation is sort of specific to that product market. And so that's where we're really going to find problems, right? And I think in part because of this, right, there's been a lot of studies of the labor market for nurses. And so it really provides us an opportunity to kind of unpack and see what's been going on here. So there is this study it's not about nurses per se, but this study by Azar and his co-authors looks at some online job listings data, right? And one of the occupations that they have in their data is nurses. And they find an HHI, labor market HHI for nurses. I should say this is a vacancy share HHI, not sort of an employment share HHI of around 2,000, right? And if you look at the rest of their paper, they say, if you have an HHI of around 2,000, increasing that by 10% would depress wages by about 1.4%, right? Okay, that might be some evidence of sort of classic monopsony power, but it's pretty small. And then Prager and Schmidt have this paper that looks at the wage effects of hospital mergers on nurses. And for this same sort of HHI of around 2,000, so if we look at hospital mergers where the pre-merger HHI in the labor market was around 2,000, they actually find no effect on nurse wages for that level of labor market concentration. So, what I take from this, right, is that, there's not much of an impact of concentration per se on wages for nurses. I don't think that means that there's not a labor market story to tell for nurses or for many other occupations. I just don't think it derives from labor market concentration. So there's a lot of different ways in which labor market power can arise, right? And it's not just from concentration. So I've highlighted a couple here, and these are the ones that we have, again, sort of specific studies about nurses that we can look to kind of see what the different impacts or what the different sources of market power are in this labor market. So Steger and his co-authors looks at this exogenous change in wages at VA hospitals and puts together this model that's really about worker preferences and search, right? Like I like to live close to the place where I like to work at the place that's sort of close to where I live, or there might be particular characteristics of the job that I really like. That I might, not like in a different location or a different employer. And what they find is that the labor supply of nurses is very inelastic, which just means, as an economist speak, right, is that nurses aren't very sensitive to changes in wages. They don't change their employment very much in response to a change in the wage. And they use that to say that this labor market friction coming from preferences and search might lead to nurses' wages to be marked down by as much as 50%. So this is a very sort of like economics-y kind of vocabulary here, right? But we sort of think of in a pure sort of competitive labor market that workers are paid what we call the marginal relevant product of their labor. So what's the additional money the firm gets from selling the output of the next worker that they hire, right? And so that's sort of held up as sort of the competitive benchmark. And so how far off are we from the competitive benchmark? Well, this labor market friction for relating to preferences and search on the part of nurses might lead to markdowns of their wages by about 50%. So that Prager and Schmidt paper I just mentioned a minute ago gives us some measurement of to what extent nurse wages are affected by changes in bargaining power, right? So they find that the increase in bargaining power that comes from mergers in very highly concentrated labor markets. So these are pre-merger HHIs in excess of 4,500, right? This is a very concentrated labor market already before the merger, okay? And that a merger in that very highly concentrated labor market would reduce nurse wages by around 7% and reduce the growth rate of nurse wages by about 50%. And then finally, another source of labor market frictions that's particularly relevant for nurses is occupational licensing. So there's been a lot of action at the state level to change scope of practice or to expand scope of practice for some sort of this class of sort of paraprofessionals. So think of like nurses, nurse practitioners, dental hygienists, people that can do some of the tasks that like doctors and dentists and other occupations do. And Kleiner and his co-authors looking at changes in scope of practice for nurses find that sort of these occupational licensing restrictions reduce nurse wages by about 5%. So overall, when you look at holistically what's going on in the labor market for nurses, I see very little evidence that labor market concentration is really suppressing nurse wages, and that really it's these labor market frictions that are really problematic. Okay. So what does this mean for these structural presumptions? I think introducing structural presumptions around labor market concentration arising from mergers are going to be really ineffective in helping workers. When most of the labor market power is not coming from increases in concentration, but is instead coming from other labor market frictions, then the structural presumptions aren't going to do very much to impact wages. I want to point out that, so sort of connecting the dots to the innovation story here, right, is that, large firms are often the most innovative and most productive and pay the highest wages, right? So if we block mergers based on structural presumptions, right, that are built on this false narrative about concentration, right, this is going to hurt workers, harm consumers, reduce innovation, economic growth. And I had this actually really fascinating conversation last night with one of the, someone from the Mississippi Attorney General's office, right? And she was telling me about this hospital merger that took place in Mississippi. So it was a hospital system based in Louisiana that purchased a hospital system based in Mississippi. And this hospital system in Mississippi, the transaction wasn't notifiable, right, because it wasn't large enough. So FTC, for example, would not have had an opportunity to review this transaction under HSR. But it also, that transaction didn't change the product market concentration, and certainly didn't change the labor market concentration, right? So this was already a market that only had the one hospital system and was just being acquired sort of in this cross-market way. And what I thought was really interesting is one of the commitments that the acquiring system made was that they were going to be raising the wages of 400 workers as a result of the merger. And then if you actually go, and I was just fascinated by this conversation, so I went and looked at the press release announcing this deal. And one of the highlights that they mention as a benefit of the deal is how it's going to impact innovation, right? So innovation in healthcare delivery through Ochsner's expanded technological and digital capabilities, including expansions in telehealth, digital monitoring, and clinical improvements guided by artificial intelligence. So this is an example of a merger that if we had structural presumptions in labor markets, this merger would have been blocked, right? There would have been no wage increases for these workers, and there would have been none of this benefit of diffusing innovations in healthcare into this hospital system in Mississippi. And this woman that I spoke to last night, she was actually really excited about this because she was excited that personally herself was going to get better healthcare as a result of the transaction. So let me leave labor market concentration there. And I just want to briefly talk about non-competes. And there is a lot of things to say about non-competes. In 5 minutes, I'm not going to say all the things, but I want to give you a flavor of the complexity here, right? So both the executive order and comments that Chair Khan has made suggest that we should expect rulemaking on non-compete agreements. Non-compete agreements are a really complicated area, I think, for rulemaking. I don't think this means that the agency shouldn't try. And I'm going to set aside the issue of whether, legally they can do this. I know all the smart lawyers here and legal scholars will have something to say about that. But setting that aside, I think this is really complicated. In part because there are some real pro-competitive benefits for some non-competes. And I want to be clear that it's not for all non-competes. So there's some real hold-up problems that non-compete agreements can help solve so that we ensure that workers get training that improves their productivity. Okay, unfortunately, right, even if we have these pro-competitive benefits of non-competes, they still depress wages by limiting workers' outside options in their mobility. So to me, this is something that really cries out for some sort of rule of reason approach, as opposed to like really bright line rules. To quickly sort of look at some of the evidence on non-competes, right? So there's a couple of papers that say, yeah, they do increase employer provision of training to workers, right? So that's a real benefit of having these agreements. But there are real wage effects. They can be pretty high for highly educated workers, lower perhaps for low skill workers, but also in those low skill workers, there's probably not a lot of efficiency justifications for those non-competes. So I would just sort of caution against sort of broad rules here in the area of non-competes, because this is a complicated space. I think it would be really unfortunate to have a broad rule that completely bans non-competes. And I think I'll just wrap up there. So I don't think there's a lot of evidence for some of the proposals. I think there's a lot of harm that can be done here, and I just would caution against being too aggressive in this space. So let me stop there and happy to take some questions.
Thank you very much, Julie, for this very interesting conversation on labor. Yeah, perhaps I know, Richard, you've written extensively on labor.
Dan.
Let's start with Dan.
Dan's going to ask the difficult economics questions. So
yeah,
go
Dan,
ahead.
Please.
No, it's not difficult. But I should preface by saying I was involved years ago representing as an expert hospitals in the Detroit metropolitan area. And there was a lawsuit brought against those hospitals, as well as hospitals in a number of other regions of the U.S., as I'm sure you're aware, Julie, claiming that there was fixing of wages of nurses. And I just want to know what your view was. The cases I know settled, but I'm curious what your view was as to whether there was any merit to those claims, and if so, what the impact was, because the claim was, as testified by Rory Ashenfelder, that there was a significant depressing effect on wages caused by collusive activities. And as you know, collusion is more likely when there's concentration. So there could be a collusion story that might have credibility.
Sure. So I'm not familiar with the case, but I mean, certainly collusion is bad. It's bad if it happens in product markets. It's bad if it happens in labor markets, right? So I don't mean to suggest that you wouldn't want aggressive enforcement against horizontal agreements. I think that's a completely legitimate area for the agencies to proceed on.
That's related to no poaching agreements.
Yeah. I mean, the no poach agreements, the wage fixing agreements. To me, that's sort of like very sort of bread and butter antitrust enforcement. It happens to apply to labor markets, fine, but I don't. To me, that
I was defending, if you will, as an expert, the hospital side. It's not that I think there was collusion, but the claim, which I think is at least a credible claim to be analyzed, would be that the likelihood of this kind of elusive activity was affected by more likely with concentration. And so that would suggest it makes sense to have some kind of structural presumption. And I'm pretty sympathetic to that view, even though I didn't think that this case had merit.
So I mean, I guess I would say this, right? So, I mean, sort of two things, right? One, I think that if you're going to have a merger, so let's focus on hospitals, because I think the issues are really sort of very clear there. I think if you're going to have a merger in a hospital market, that is going to have a labor market effect, right? That would make it easier for firms to collude or just to sort of generate some sort of classic monopsony power in the labor market for skilled workers that their skills are tied to the hospital, right? I think you could have a product market problem too, right? So I would point to that study by Prager and Schmidt, where for HHIs, pre-merger HHIs that were really high, right? So in that sort of middling range, right, that the agencies are definitely going to look at these mergers carefully, there's no wage effects from the mergers, right? It's only when you get to those really highly concentrated labor markets where you're talking about a labor market, a hospital labor market, right? So I mean, they're careful there that they're not looking at the entire labor market for nurses, right? But just focused on the hospitals, right? You're talking about a market that has maybe 2 or 3 hospitals. That merger is going to get challenged on a product market basis.
Thank you.
So I just don't, and I think the really important contribution of that Prager and Schmidt paper is they don't find any employment effects, right? This is all bargaining. This is all, we've made the outside options worse for nurses. And so to me, that calls not for a antitrust sort of recommendation or solution or remedy, right? But we need to do something about worker bargaining power, right? So this, and they also find this in their paper, that those wage effects are mitigated by higher unionization. So when nurses are unionized, the wage effects are smaller. So to me, that says the right policy here is not structural presumptions for labor markets, but is let's work on the labor law, labor policy side of this and give workers greater bargaining power.
Right. That's very interesting. Richard, you've written extensively on this topic.
I've actually.
Is there something you haven't written extensively on, Richard? That's the sense that I'm getting here during this
actually, in the last year, I've written 3 long papers on this subject. And I mean, I can't go into all of them. I think you're correct that by far the best of the papers is the Prager and Schmidt.
For sure.
But I don't think, let me say one of the reasons why. If you look at the Azar paper and the other papers, they're all using proxies for wages. They're not using wages. And the proxies they use are inversely related to wages in some cases. So it's completely screwed up. So if you
I did not highlight all the problems with those papers.
No, but I mean,
just to say what evidence we have, how.
Yeah, but I mean, but the Azar paper is the one that's most cited. And it's one where you sort of try to figure out
the most problematic one, I think, too.
Yeah, that you cite what sort of posted wages are. You don't know whether they're agreement. And if you start looking for the number of jobs that are being sought, it has no correlation whatsoever with market power. So you could be a small company on the way up and you're giving lots of office to sorts of people. You could be a large company in Dan Crane's universe that is on the way down. You're getting very few. That doesn't tell you anything about the observed wages that you're going to get or give you any reason to believe why it ought to be. The other thing is, it is only in the markets that you're talking about, there are at least several factors going on. There is employer concentration, and I believe that in the hospital markets, having worked with the University of Chicago and other hospitals on these things over the years, it's a serious issue. But the union structure is extremely important, and the licensing restrictions are extremely important in these particular cases. And if forced to pick as amongst the three, what's happened about licensing is it's absolutely universal, and you can't sort of duck it one way or another. Even with the hospital power, there's the home market, the geographical movements, and all the rest of that. So on the evidentiary side, I mean, if you don't get the proxies right, everything else is going to wrong. Also, the theory makes absolutely no sense. So I asked a noted personnel expert, i.e. my son, who's done this work for 30 years, with 10 or 15 years. I said to him, let's go to labor markets, and you want to hire computer experts. He said, what do you need to do in order to go from the hospital market on the one hand to, say, the high-tech market? And the answer. And there was only one word he said: you know how to code. Anything else doesn't matter in terms of the mobility. So that what happens is, when you're dealing with highly intelligent labor, the definition of intelligence is the ability to switch from one task to another by virtue of the information that you acquire. And that is actually borne out, so that the market and the product end of this stuff may be very, very narrow. But on the labor part, it turns out, if coding is what you need, there must be a billion firms that need coders all the time. You start looking at wages, you could do it. The other thing you can look at, which they don't do, is you take a bunch of people, and I've asked my son about this too. He said, where did your last 10 people come from? Right? What industry did they come from if you're hiring, say, for coders? And it turns out they come from 10 different industries. If you look at the New York Times, they say, well, where are we going to get our new coders from? The really difficult industry is teaching. It's underpaid, underserviced. And so there's a mass descent on these people to try to locate them somewhere else. And so all the relocation studies, the re-education studies, the job transfer studies, been no relationship to what's going on here. And I just mentioned one other thing. If you look at all these studies, there's no subcontracting, right? So you never ask the question, well, I can't do this very well. Can I hire somebody who can? Well, for example, you're a construction guy and you need to get fuel or a gas station. Well, it turns out you don't go and hire for the fuel. What you do is you contract with somebody, and he has a fleet that covers an entire company or so forth, 16 different guys or whatever it is, and they do that to you. So you can't infer from the fact that you've got a monopoly on prices that you could do it. And the last point, of course, is the data is worthless. Wages give you no information about total compensation in the way that prices give you wages, because it's a one-dimensional variable in a product market and it's an n-dimensional variable in the other market. So what are these people talking about?
Well, but I think that even the studies that are trying to be careful, so I think, as you mentioned, the Prager and Schmidt study is one of them. Even in the careful studies, which take account of things like, you're not only compensated through wages, are still finding that this is not a sort of classic monopsony problem, and that really there are other labor markets.
Yeah, but just the last point on this, the other thing to understand is that wages are a function of risk. So if you're an established company and you're not in the Crane decline mode, you will not have to pay a wage premium, because if you're a startup, you might. And if you're a startup, much more of the compensation is going to be in warrants or in ledgered stock or restricted stock or something or other. So that the comparability by just looking at the wage numbers is not there. And so when Elizabeth Warren says it's a $10,000 hit, A, she's taken the top emphasis from a single study, but B, it doesn't take into account any of the risk dimensions associated with what's going on.
Agreed.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Richard, for this great rebuttal. And of course, thank you so much.
Well, we're taking a 15-minute break now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Julie, for the great presentations.